Here's your host, Alex Garrett.
Welcome back to One Leg Up with Alex Garrett.
Well, rocking Lady Liberty this Veterans Day weekend because obviously she's a symbol of freedom. She's a symbol of what our men and women fight for every day, and it's important this Veterans Day weekend to recognize that. But my next guest, Naval Captain William Toti, this was on my wire, is helping veterans when they come off the battlefield and come home, transition back into civilian life. But firstly, Captain Toti, thanks for joining the Alex Garrett Podcast Network.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you for having me.
Now, you're in the Naval, but you can speak on the military as a whole, I believe. That's why I wanted you on today. But when it comes to Veterans Day, what does this day mean to you?
Well, it's a wonderful opportunity to recognize the service and sacrifice of our veterans. Obviously, we've got 3 holidays during the year that do similar but different things. Memorial Day honors those who were killed in action from the military. There's Armed Forces Day that honor those that are still on active duty, and Veterans Day honor those who have served, like me. And so each has a different, spin on a similar theme. And it's very nice that the country does this, particularly for the veterans that struggled a bit more than I did on my active duty time, that they get recognized appropriately.
Now, there's a big debate, I always think, and it might be minute to you, but there's always do we say happy or how do we say, because no one really wants to say happy Memorial Day, it just comes naturally. So how would you address it? Is it a happy day? Is it sort of like a somber day all 3 days, or how would you address them?
I would say generally Veterans Day is a happier day, certainly, than Memorial Day, right? It's for those veterans who are still alive. And those who have passed, but just passed, in the normal course of life. My uncle was a World War II veteran. He survived the war, and he died, lived to a ripe old age. And when I think of Veterans Day, I think of him too. But even though he's no longer with us, so yeah, it's difficult to decide what the appropriate way to say Happy Veterans Day, but it's as good as any.
Well, let's get to the heart of the matter, and I'll get to your experience in the military, but what you're doing for veterans, from CO to CEO, it's why I have a lot of different CEOs on, because you guys have a different story. You became a CEO, and now you're helping civilian veterans transition back into civilian life. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's essentially what I'm doing, and I'm doing it out of the frustration I felt when I was in private industry, trying to help veterans succeed. So I had a 26-year active duty career. When I transitioned to industry, I thought I knew a lot more about how to succeed in business than I really did. And I almost crashed and burned myself. I was lucky enough to have a very good mentor who was actually my boss's boss, who had personal capital invested in my success and for whatever reason wanted to see me succeed. So when I started struggling, he took it upon himself to try to help me understand what was happening and help me do better and get better in my career, in my industry career. Now, keep in mind, at the point I entered industry, I had already served as a commanding officer of a nuclear submarine. I had already served as a commodore of a fast attack squadron of 6 nuclear submarines, and I still was screwing up a fairly basic leadership position in industry. What I didn't realize that military and industry are so different that many of the skills that allow you to succeed in the military not only don't allow you to succeed in industry, some of them set you up for failure. I also didn't understand that the military itself screws up veterans as they leave the service and enter industry by telling them things that just aren't true. They try to make the veteran feel good about his or her active duty service by telling them that their experience on active duty will directly translate to success in industry. And that is absolutely not true. The skills you learn in the military can be helpful in industry, but a lot of the talent and behaviors you develop in the military can also be harmful in civilian life. So if you don't understand that and don't understand how to adapt those behaviors and skills to civilian life, you're going to be just like I was, on the verge of crashing and burning. And too often, veterans do fail. In fact, here's a statistic. 200,000 or so veterans leave active duty every year to enter civilian industry. About 50% of those 200,000 will leave their first job within 2 years of entering the private marketplace, either because they got fired, because they didn't adapt well, or they quit because they didn't adapt well. And that's a statistic that's very, it's terrible, right? So when I was in, private service in private practice, I did try to help veterans individually by mentoring, but I could only help a handful at a time. When I decided I was going to retire for the second time out of my full-time industry job, I said, now how can I help a broader swath of veterans help them keep from making the same mistakes over and over again? I decided the best way to do that was to write all these lessons down. And that's how this book evolved.
And tell us about the book, because obviously it's important for not just veterans, but everyday life people as well, I would think, right? But when you wrote this book, I'm sure you were inspired by the stories you were hearing of your fellow veterans that were not adapting well into their communities, right? Or weren't even being given the option to adapt well, if you will.
I sure was, Alex. And there's a couple of aspects of that are worth talking about. And the first one is when you leave the military, particularly if you leave it as a senior enlisted or senior officer, and your boss is somebody who never served in the military, what ends up happening is those bosses have a hard time having challenging conversation with you as an employee. And if I could characterize it, I would characterize it like this. You were a senior enlisted leader, senior officer. Who am I to tell you that you need to develop your leadership skills, that your leadership skills aren't getting you where you need to be, right? You were a senior leader in the military. Who am I to tell you how to be a better leader? And what ends up happening is a lot of these civilian bosses, when faced with failure in their veteran employees, would rather just let them go than have that challenging conversation with them and help them understand how to get better. And when I talk to my active duty friends, I tell them, you may think you're a good leadership, and leadership is hard, but it's even harder when you're leading people who can actually quit. And you never had that problem when you're on active duty. Your troops couldn't quit, no matter how much they didn't like your leadership style. There was no place for them to go. In civilian industry, your people vote with their feet. If they don't like the way you're leading, they just quit. And that's something that active duty people have a hard time adjusting to.
This is interesting because you mentioned industry, but do you find that a lot of the veterans go into, as say, industrial jobs, or do they go into sort of like, real estate or insurance, or is it mainly they go into the field they know the most?
I think most of them try to go into the field they know the most, to leverage the military skills to the maximum extent possible. Veterans are not monolithic. Some of them do say, look, I think I'd like to try this real estate thing or this insurance sales thing, because they see it as a path to rapid, revenue growth and things like that, right? But selling, when you're a veteran, a lot of veterans do kind of turn their nose up at the thought of going into sales, that kind of transactional sales, in particular when they're put in a position where their job is to sell to their friends.
Right.
on active duty, right? And so I think, a lot of guys and gals just want to get away and do something as different as possible from what they've done on active duty. But a larger percentage say, look, I've spent 5, 10, 15, 20 years developing this particular skill set. I don't want to waste all that time I spent on active duty developing those skills. So yeah, I'd like to do something that comes close to what I was doing on active duty.
Now, I've gotten to know some veterans over the years who have started their own foundations, their own businesses, and I'm sure this book From CEO to CEO gets involved with that as well. Because hey, if the private sector is not hiring or doing a great job at it, why don't you go on your own path? Is that kind of what you advocate as well?
Yeah, I talk about starting your own thing in my book. There are a lot of challenges to doing that I would call babe in the wood veterans who just got out of the military and have this pie in the sky concept of what that's going to be like just don't understand. There are a lot of tripwires and hazards to starting your own thing. And so I don't tell veterans don't do it. What I tell them is, if you're going to do it, number one, read my book, because I do outline all the hazards. And number two, you better have a lot of cash put aside, because you're going to go a long time with zero income. And that may not be something you can live with if you have a mortgage and kids in college and things like that. So you better understand fully, all of the disadvantages, for the very few advantages that comes with.
All right, I got to ask you this, because when I think of civilian life for veterans, we're talking about mental health aspects as well. We're talking about integrating back into family life. And I'm sure this new book that you have, because you've experienced this yourself, that integration back into your family life and your mental health, well-being and whatnot, that all came to play when you left the military and came back home, right, into civilian life?
Absolutely true. The most challenging thing from the family perspective when you're on active duty is going on deployment. And I did 7 deployments during my active duty time. The second most challenging thing is coming home from deployment and having to reintegrate into your family when they've developed all these behaviors to compensate for your absence. And now suddenly you inject yourself back into that environment and you think it's going to go back to the way it was before you left. And that is a difficult struggle. When you finally do leave the military, some families say, wait a minute, fortunately, this wasn't true for my family, but those periodic absences actually were a good thing. We got a little break from each other and, we were able to decompress. And then when we got back together, we realized how much we love each other and, need each other. And then when those breaks don't happen anymore, and suddenly you're there 24/7, 12 months a year, some families have a difficult time adjusting to that. But you're right about the fact that difficult transitions generate mental health issues, stress, that only add to the other burdens of having to adapt to a new culture, a new environment, a new work, life balance, and a whole bunch of other new factors, learning a new job. And when you add the challenges of no longer being around the familiar military environment, it can lead to PTSD, the PTSD that you might otherwise have from your combat experience and other stresses that you can't just erase. So, while I don't address the PTSD issue in my book, I leave that to others who are expert in the field. If you don't transition well into your job, that just adds yet one more stressor to all of the other stressors in your life. So that's my focus, and that's the issue I try to help with.
If I'm honest, a lot of veterans, I think, start to feel like the government has failed them, if we can get into that real quick. And did you leave the military feeling like, okay, I'm proud I served my country, but where was my government? Or do you not touch that in the book?
100%. I touch it in my book. First of all, the government sets you up for failure by telling you things that just aren't true about your life in the civilian world. And, I talk about in the book, I say it's somewhat the blind leading the blind, because the guys and gals teaching these courses, these military transition courses, have no idea what they're doing because they've never done it themselves. They've never transitioned to civilian jobs themselves. So I would say that's the positive spin on the government failure. The negative spin is that they just don't care, that they're not incentivized to help veterans succeed because there's no metric of veteran success that they're measured against. Nobody in government is scored based on how well their transitioning veterans do following their active duty service. So they don't care. I mean, that's the non-positive. That's the negative view at why the dynamic is so bad. And then, of course, the Veterans Administration is an organization filled, but it's filled with people who really want to do a good job, but can't, because they're anchored by typical government bureaucracy, inefficiency, ineffectiveness, ineptness, the Peter Principle, executives who shouldn't be in their position but can't be fired because of the protection rules for federal employees, and a whole bunch of other factors that go into inhibiting the Veterans Administration from being able to do a good job for their vets. And so all of that mixes to a very negative experience for the transitioning veteran. Again, I can't do anything about helping the VA. I can't do anything about PTSD. I'm not a mental health expert. My niche is helping the veteran eliminate one potential stressor, and that's the job stressor.
This is fascinating because I also want to know, are you still proud that you serve your country, though? That's my other question.
Absolutely, 100%. I would not have changed a thing, Alex. I wouldn't have changed, going to the Naval Academy, spending 26 years in the Navy on active duty, being a submariner. Heck, I was in the Pentagon on 9/11, and I lived when my friends died. I wouldn't change the fact that I was there that day, because it was an inflection point in my life. I wouldn't change. I would love to change the fact that my friends died, but again, that's not something I can actually do. I had some survivor's guilt from that, but I figured that out and I worked through that, and so there's nothing about my military career I would change. 100% proud of what I did, and everything I did for those 26 years.
What was the most exciting or best mission you had to do while in the Navy? And I feel like it's something you could recall to this day, right?
Yeah. Unfortunately, the most exciting, best experience I ever had, I'll never be able to talk about. It was one of those super secret things you do on a submarine that I can't talk about when I was captain. I will tell you, it was so important and super secret, they brought me back to the White House to brief about what we had done. So that kind of gives, I know that's a teaser. I apologize. That's about all I can say about it. But it was very, very, it was spy novel kind of thriller stuff that you can't make up. It's the truth is actually more exciting than much of the fiction.
Here in America, we do the Veterans of the Game every day, for different arenas, different sports venues and what. But I always feel like Americans rally around veterans 3 times a year, the 3 times you mentioned, and then it's sort of like we put them back, back until May or November, and that shouldn't be. We should always continue this conversation past those 3 days, shouldn't we?
Well, yeah, but I got to tell you, I'm old enough to remember the Vietnam era. And I remember our troops coming back home from Vietnam. And in fact, when I first enlisted in the Navy before I went to Annapolis in 1975, the Vietnam War was largely over at that point. The draft had ended in 1973. No, I enlisted in 1974. And so in 1974, I'm walking through Chicago O'Hare Airport in uniform, coming home from boot camp. And there was a Vietnam War protest going on outside the airport, and a woman spit on me. Okay, imagine that. I'm 17 years old, coming home from boot camp. I'm a kid. I'm in uniform, and a woman spit on me because I'm in uniform. That's how unpopular the Vietnam War was. I'd never been to Vietnam. I'd never been anywhere except for boot camp. Now, when you contrast that, Alex, with what's going on today, with thank you for your service, I'm so grateful that the nation has evolved since the 1960s and 70s in their respect and appreciation for veterans. So I don't worry about the fact that we only think about it 3 days a year. I think, and most people are very gracious to me personally, and I'm very grateful for that.
Well, that's a great line. I'm glad too, because we should always thank a veteran, which is kind of a theme around Veterans Day, and thank them every day that we see them. And that brings me to my next point. We do see a lot of veterans on the streets. They're homeless. And does this book help find resources for people that may not have a home right now? And how do you tackle that issue, Captain Toti?
I would say not directly. There are great organizations that work that issue. The only thing I would say is that failure to transition well into a civilian job can lead to that homelessness that you're talking about. And so the degree to which people don't thrive in their civilian job once they leave the military does increase the risk of homelessness. And so if I can help them thrive in that civilian job by helping them understand the pitfalls as they make that transition, I hope I help indirectly to address that problem as well.
Captain Toti, you see all these different elevations of General Milley to becoming general. You see Austin Lloyd become the Department of Defense head. But do they lose their touch for the soldier on the ground once they become elevated? I feel like that's what you're getting at here.
The good ones don't. And I have known some that have. So let me tell you, I don't want to tell you that that doesn't happen, because it does. But the good ones, and I can count both, Secretary of Defense Austin and General Milley in that category. And I've had many, many, many good admiral bosses that also fit into this category. They do not lose their touch with the sailor. Here's a funny story. When I was enlisted and I got accepted to Annapolis, and my boss was a senior chief petty officer, realized that I was going to be an officer. He pulled me out of the job I was in as an enlisted man. And for the next 3 months, while I was waiting to start Annapolis, my job was cleaning the heads, cleaning the toilets on that base. So for 3 months, I cleaned toilets. And his point to me was he might have been a little bit over the top, but a little cruel and harsh in this lesson. But he said to me, I never want you to forget what it's like to be an enlisted man where someone has 100% control over your life. And his way of doing that was to have me clean toilets for 3 months. So no, I hope I never lost touch with my sailors, and troops in different jobs over my active career.
Because you went from captain to CEO in everyday life. So what was that transition like for you? And what lessons did you take from the military to become a leader off the ship, if you will, and on shore?
Yeah, one of the things I point out in the book is that there's a lot of military people who've been commanding officers who think that it's the equivalent of being a CEO in civilian life. And in the book, I try to make sure that they understand that is not true. When I was CEO, and some CEOs, not many CEOs, some CEOs have great authority over their troops, over their people in their command. But they don't get to pick their mission. They don't get to pick their strategy. They don't get to pick where they're going to go, what they're going to do. They don't get to decide what their budget's going to be. They don't get to do any of the things that every CEO has to do. And the reason I make that point is they delude themselves into believing that the positions are equivalent and develop a sense of hubris when it comes to thinking that they're fully capable of doing a kind of job in industry that they see as equivalent to their CEO job, when they are very, very, very different. And I go through that a lot in the book. Because when I didn't understand that when I first transitioned into industry. I did think that a CEO is the military equivalent of a CEO. And I didn't realize that, look, a CEO, I was making all the hiring decisions. I couldn't do that as CEO. There's a whole bunch of things I had to do as CEO that I couldn't do as CEO. So they're not the same. It's a very intense learning curve. And those that do well do really, really well.
Have you felt
yeah.
like you're CEO now, or is there still a lot to learn for you, Captain Toti?
Well, I mean, I've retired from my CEO position so I could focus more time on this. But I'm always learning. There's always more to learn. And I'm happy to learn every day.
Couple of things, current events wise, we see now ships deployed in the Middle East. And I feel like this Veterans Day, there is that possibility of American troops being deployed hanging over everybody's head. What are you thinking when you see those in the Middle East? Are we bound to be involved with these conflicts now?
We have to be ready to be involved. So part of me says, I wish I was there. I wish I was back in uniform. You know, this is an important mission. But one of the things that folks need to understand about the Navy and the Marine Corps, to some extent, smaller units in the Army and Air Force as well, is that the Navy and the Marine Corps deploy continuously in peacetime and in war. So it's not a big deal for two carrier strike groups to be underway, deployed at the same time. And those two carrier strike groups do need to be ready to go to war at a moment's notice. They do. Does that mean I think that they will? I hope that they don't. But if they're not there or not ready, the probability that we will be pulled into this war goes up. The presence of naval power at sea is the greatest guarantor of peace. And that's the thing that the Navy Marine Corps bring. The other distinction for the Navy Marine Corps is we operate independently and from sovereign United States territory. If you're going to launch a strike from another country's land, property, territory, you generally need that country's permission to do it. When you launch a strike from a Navy ship at sea, that's Navy sovereign, that's United States sovereign territory. You don't need anybody's permission to do it. So it gives you a whole lot more flexibility that the other, services may not have when they're operating from the land. So those are important things that Americans need to understand about their Navy and Marine Corps. It doesn't mean we don't need the Army troops in Syria and Iraq. We absolutely do, the Air Force troops that are there. But the fact that they're there and the fact that they've been targets, a lot of people have pointed out, holy cow, maybe we'd be better off if all of our forces were operating from sea rather than on the ground in those countries, right?
Interesting take. Well, Captain Toti, I want to ask you one last thing because I'm New York City based. So
Sure.
Have you ever been a participant in Fleet Week any Memorial Days?
I haven't been to Fleet Week in decades. I did in the mid 90s and not since. I go up to New York, love the city, go up to it periodically. Was just up there for a month or two ago to see a wonderful Broadway show called The Shark is Broken, about the USS Indianapolis, great Navy ship, about the movie Jaws and its relationship to the USS Indianapolis. But yeah, I get up there as often as I can, but I haven't been to Fleet Week in a long time. I went there as a midshipman. In fact, I sailed in New York Harbor when I was at the Academy in 1977, Operation Sail. And that was my first real visit. And what a great time that was.
Well, this has been very special, and I love to have back on as things are going. It's never easy when you hear the president say, "Yeah, we are keeping an eye on and getting involved with two conflicts at the same time. That's never easy for an American to hear, and I'm sure the average American family who has a veteran or even those deployed right now are a little bit on their edge. So I'm glad you gave us a little calming advice today as well.
Yep, happy to, and happy to be here. Thank you, Alex.
Perfect. Thank you so much, sir. God bless, Captain.
Same to you. Take care.